The moment Caroline Pritchard realized the river was not going to cooperate with her carefully laid plans, she sat down on the tongue of her wagon, folded her hands in her lap, and told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry. She had come too far and endured too much to cry over a swollen river in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, in the blazing September of 1873. She had left Cincinnati with 23 crates of books, a letter of employment from the newly established schoolhouse in Harlan's Creek, and the absolute certainty that a woman of 26 with a good education and a stubborn constitution could make it just fine on her own in the West. She had told her mother that. She had told her younger sister that. She had told the rather smug gentleman at the Cincinnati Immigrant Society office that, after he had looked her up and down, and suggested she might be better served finding a husband before heading into frontier territory. None of them had accounted for the Cimarron River in late September after 3 days of hard rain upstream, and none of them were here now to help her figure out what to do about it. The crossing that the man in Dodge City had marked on her map with a casual pencil scratch was supposed to be shallow, passable, manageable even for a lone driver with a heavily loaded wagon. What it actually was, on this particular Tuesday afternoon, was a churning, brown, muscular body of water that had swallowed its own banks and was spreading itself across the flats with a kind of indifferent satisfaction, as though it had always meant to be this wide and this deep and this completely impassable. Caroline stood up and walked to the edge of the water. She stuck the end of her driving whip into it and watched it lean downstream under the current. The water was up to her knee at the very edge, which meant it was certainly deeper in the middle, which meant her wagon, her horses, her books, and very possibly herself would be swept away and deposited somewhere downstream that was not Harlan's Creek and was not a schoolhouse waiting for her arrival. She walked back to the wagon. Her horses, a matched pair of bays named Robert and Thackeray after authors she admired, stood with their heads down and their ears flattened, looking as though they too had opinions about the situation, and those opinions were deeply pessimistic. "I know," she told them. "I agree with you." She climbed back up to the wagon seat and looked at the map. Harlan's Creek was 19 miles east and slightly south. The nearest marked town in the other direction was Pratt, which was 12 miles back west, and going back to Pratt felt like a kind of defeat that she was not prepared to accept on a Tuesday. She had been making excellent time. She had managed the first 2 river crossings without incident. She had camped alone for 4 nights without anything more alarming than a coyote sniffing around her campfire, which she had addressed by throwing a boot at it, and then feeling immediately regretful when it yelped and ran. She looked east down the river bank. She looked west. She thought about the schoolchildren waiting in Harlan's Creek, who apparently had no books at all, which was a situation she found genuinely unconscionable. She thought about the salary she would not collect if she did not arrive by the 1st of October, which was 8 days away. She thought about the fact that the school board in Harlan's Creek had been skeptical about hiring a woman from the East in the first place, and that arriving late would do nothing to improve their confidence in her. She sat there for a long time while the river ran past, and the September sky turned from blue to the particular shade of copper and gold that preceded evening in the Kansas grassland, and she was so absorbed in the mechanical work of thinking through her options that she did not hear the horse until it was very close. "You are going to want to back that wagon up about 30 feet, said a voice. Caroline startled so badly that she nearly dropped the reins. She spun on the seat to find a man on a gray horse sitting about 20 feet behind her on the bank, watching her with calm dark eyes under the shadow of a battered hat. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and brown from the sun, wearing a canvas coat that had seen considerable use and boots that told a similar story. He had a coil of rope on his saddle and a rifle in the scabbard, and the general unhurried manner of a man who had seen worse situations than this one and come through them more or less intact. "Excuse me," Caroline said. "The bank," he said, and nodded toward the wagon wheels. "It is softer than it looks." You have been sitting there about an hour and the front wheels are sinking. If you do not back up, you will have a different problem than the river when you try to leave." Caroline looked down at the wheels. He was right. The ground that had appeared solid was wet clay underneath a thin crust of dried grass, and both front wheels had indeed settled several inches deeper than they had been when she stopped. "How long have you been sitting there?" she demanded. "Long enough to see you were thinking hard," he said. "I did not want to interrupt." He said it without any trace of mockery, which was so unexpected that Caroline blinked. Most men who encountered a woman in a difficult situation in her experience moved immediately to a sort of theatrical helpfulness that was really about demonstrating their own competence rather than addressing her actual problem. This man sounded as though he genuinely had not wanted to interrupt her thinking. "I see," she said. She gathered the reins and backed Robert and Thackeray up the bank with some difficulty, because Robert had opinions about backing, and when the wheels were clear of the soft clay she set the brake and climbed down. "Thank you for mentioning it." "You are welcome," he said. He had dismounted by then and was standing beside his horse with one hand on the bridle. Up close he was taller than he had appeared, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that needed a razor and hands that looked like they had been worked hard for a long time. There was a quietness about him that Caroline found unexpectedly steadying, as though his presence subtracted some of the ambient alarm from the situation rather than adding to it. "Charles Hartwell," he said, and held out his hand. "Caroline Pritchard," she said, and shook it firmly, because she had learned that a firm handshake communicated things about a woman that saved considerable amounts of time in introductions. "I am attempting to reach Harlan's Creek. I have been told this crossing is passable." "In ordinary conditions," he said. He looked at the river without expression. "There was significant rain north of here 4 days ago. This river runs about twice its normal volume for about a week after a good rain upstream. I would not try it today." "I cannot afford to wait a week," Caroline said. "I know a shallower crossing," he said, "about 3 miles south. It adds to your distance, but it is safer. I came from Harlan's Creek this morning. I can take you across." Caroline looked at him. She was a practical woman, and she was aware that practical women in 1873 did not simply follow strange men 3 miles along a riverbank because they claimed to know a better crossing. She was also a practical woman who understood that darkness was coming, that her wagon was too heavily loaded to manage a flooded crossing alone, and that the alternative was camping on the bank alone for several days, which presented its own set of complications. She assessed him as carefully as she knew how. The horse was well kept. The rope was a working rope, not a theatrical one. His eyes, when he looked at her, held neither the calculating gleam she had learned to watch for nor the dismissive blankness that meant a man was looking through her rather than at her. He looked like a man who had said what he meant and meant what he said and was waiting patiently for her to decide what she wanted to do with that. "What brings you out this way?" she asked. "I run cattle," he said. "I have a place about 7 miles east of Harlan's Creek. I was in Dodge for supplies. I come home this way." "Do you know anyone in Harlan's Creek?" she asked. "Anyone who could vouch for you?" Something shifted in his expression very slightly. It might have been approval. "Tom Aldridge at the feed store," he said. "Reverend Hawes at the Methodist Church. The Weber family has the farm on the north side of town. I have known all of them for about 3 years." "All right," Caroline said. "Show me the crossing." They went along the south bank with the river running beside them and the evening light going long and golden across the grass, and Caroline drove the wagon while Charles Hartwell rode slightly ahead, picking the line that kept them clear of the softer ground near the water. He did not chatter. He did not offer unsolicited opinions about her horses or her driving or the wisdom of a woman traveling alone through southern Kansas. He simply rode ahead and she followed, and after about 40 minutes of travel, he stopped at a place where the river widened and flattened and ran quietly over a gravel bed. "Here," he said. "It is still higher than usual, but the gravel holds the bottom. I will go first and you can see the line." He rode across ahead of her, his gray horse moving through water that reached its belly at the deepest point but never lost its footing, and he came up the far bank and turned and waited. Caroline looked at the river. She looked at her horses. She thought about 23 crates of books and what river water would do to them. "Can you help me cover the books before I cross?" she asked. He rode back across without hesitation. Together they worked for 20 minutes in the fading light, stretching a canvas tarpaulin over the back of the wagon and tying it down as tight as it would go. Caroline noticed that he worked efficiently and without wasted motion, and that he moved around her horses with confidence and without startle, and that he secured his knots with a method she recognized as a proper teamster's hitch, rather than the fumbling slip knots of someone pretending to know what they were doing. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she said. She drove Robert and Thackeray into the water and kept them moving steady and straight the way her father had taught her. Because the worst thing in a river crossing was to let horses hesitate and turn. And the water came up over the floorboards of the wagon, and Caroline held her breath and kept the line. And then the gravel was rising under the wheels, and they were climbing the far bank with river water streaming from the undercarriage. And all 23 crates of books were wet on the outside of the tarp but dry underneath. Caroline let out a long breath. "Well done," Charles Hartwell said. She looked at him. He was not being patronizing. He was stating a fact in the same tone he would use to note that the weather was clear or the grass was dry. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with more depth than the simple words conveyed. The light was nearly gone now, the sky going from copper to deep violet over the flat horizon, and Charles looked at it and then looked at her. "Harlan's Creek is still about 14 miles, he said. "You cannot make it tonight. There is a creek flat about 2 miles ahead, good grass for the horses, good water. If you have no objection, I will camp there as well. You will be safer with company." "I have camped alone 4 nights, Caroline said. "I know," he said. "You handle yourself fine. I am not suggesting otherwise. I am suggesting that you might sleep better." Again, no condescension. Just a straightforward observation about the practical reality of sleeping in open country. Caroline thought about it for about 3 seconds. 2 miles ahead," she said. "Lead the way." The creek flat was a good camp. The grass was thick and green from the recent rain. The creek ran clear over limestone, and there were cottonwood trees tall enough to break the wind that was starting to move out of the north. Caroline unharnessed Robert and Thackeray and staked them on a long line where the grass was best, and Charles unsaddled his gray horse and put him on the same line, and they built a fire from cottonwood deadfall without discussing who would gather wood and who would strike the flint, because they simply each did half of it. "I have coffee and cornbread," Caroline said when the fire was going, "and some salt pork." "I have dried beef and a tin of peaches," he said. "Between us that is a proper meal." They ate beside the fire with the creek talking quietly nearby and the stars coming out overhead in the enormous Kansas sky, and Caroline felt something she had not felt in 5 days of traveling, which was a kind of ease. Not the ease of being safe in a familiar place, but something different, something that had to do with the particular quality of the silence between herself and this man, which was not awkward and not tense and not demanding anything from her. "What is in the wagon?" he asked eventually. "Books," she said. He looked at her, waiting. "I am going to teach school in Harlan's Creek," she said. "The school board wrote to Cincinnati asking for a teacher. I was recommended. The books are for the students. Most of them are McGuffey readers, but there are also arithmetic primers and a set of natural history books and some fiction, because I believe children should have access to fiction regardless of what school boards think about it." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "What does the school board in Harlan's Creek think about fiction?" "I do not yet know," Caroline said. "But I have strong opinions on the subject that I intend to make very clearly known at the earliest appropriate opportunity." This time the corner of his mouth moved definitively into something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and Caroline found herself watching it with more attention than was strictly necessary. "You are from Cincinnati," he said. It was not quite a question. "Born and raised," she said. "My father kept a bookshop. I grew up surrounded by books and the people who love them, which gives a person certain convictions. What convictions? That reading is not a luxury, she said. It is the foundation of everything else. That a child who can read well can teach herself almost anything. That the single most useful thing you can give a frontier community is a good library. Paused. My father used to say that a town with a library is a town with a future. Charles looked at the fire for a moment. That is a good thing to believe, he said. Do you read? She asked. Some, he said. I was not well schooled. I can read and figure well enough for what I need. I have some books at the house. What books? He looked slightly self-conscious for the first time in a way that Caroline found entirely endearing without quite knowing why. There is a Bible, he said. A copy of Dickens. A trail guide from 10 years ago that is mostly wrong about everything. And a book about grasses and range management that I found genuinely useful. Dickens, she said. My mother sent it with me when I came west, he said. She thought the frontier would be lonely, and she was right. The fire crackled. The horses moved quietly on their line. Somewhere in the cottonwoods an owl was conducting its nighttime business with its usual editorial commentary about the state of the world. Is it still lonely? Caroline asked, and then thought that was perhaps too personal a question for a woman to ask a man she had known for 3 hours. But Charles Hartwell did not seem to find it too personal. He considered it with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything, as though the question deserved real thought rather than a reflexive social answer. Less than it was, he said finally, and then said nothing more, and Caroline let it rest there. She slept that night in the wagon, under the canvas with her boots on, as she had the previous 4 nights, and she did not worry, and she slept better than she had since Cincinnati, which she did not examine too closely. In the morning the camp smelled like wood smoke and creek water and the sweet damp smell of September grass, and Charles had the fire going and coffee made before she woke, which she discovered when she climbed down from the wagon and found him sitting on a log with 2 tin cups and a focused expression directed at a point about 6 inches above the horizon. You made coffee, she said. I wake early, he said. Always have. She took the cup he offered, and they stood at the edge of the creek and watched the light come up over the flat land, the sky going from gray to peach to a clear, brilliant blue, and the dew was thick on the grass and the horses were grazing in the long morning light, and Caroline thought that there were very few moments in her life that had been as simply beautiful as this one. Tell me about Harlan's Creek, she said. He told her. It was a town of about 300 people, grown up around a trading post that had been there since the late 1860s when the cattle drives were still coming through. There was a general store, a feed merchant, a blacksmith, a hotel of middling quality, the Methodist church, a saloon that Reverend Hawes had strong feelings about, and a newly built schoolhouse that was the pride of the Women's Improvement Society and the quiet anxiety of the school board, who had hired a teacher from Cincinnati with no clear picture of what they were actually getting. They are decent people, Charles said. Hard-working. They want good things for their children. Some of them are nervous about a woman teacher from the East. They will come around when they see you know what you are doing. How do you know I know what I am doing? Caroline asked. You drove a loaded wagon across a flooded river at dusk without losing your horses or your cargo, he said. That tells me something about a person. Caroline laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, coming out fuller and more genuine than she had expected, and she saw him look at her when she laughed with an expression she could not quite name. They broke camp with the same wordless efficiency as the previous evening and set out eastward toward Harlan's Creek, Charles riding slightly ahead and Caroline driving the wagon. And the morning was clear, and the road was a decent wagon track across the grass. And they talked as they traveled in the comfortable way of people who have already gotten through the awkward parts of getting to know each other and are now simply learning each other in earnest. She learned that he had come west from Missouri in 1868 at the age of 22, which made him now 28, 3 years ahead of her own 26. He had worked cattle drives for 2 years, saving money, and had bought his land east of Harlan's Creek in 1870 with every dollar he had, and then spent 2 years building it into something that could sustain itself. He ran about 300 head of cattle, which in the language of Kansas ranching in 1873 was not large but was solid and honest and his own. He had built the house himself, starting with one room and adding to it as time and materials allowed. He had a hand named Alejandro who had been with him for 2 years and was, in Charles's words, twice the rancher he himself was, and too modest to say so. He asked about her family, and she told him about her father's bookshop, and the way she had grown up among the shelves, doing her schoolwork at a table in the back, while customers browsed the front and her father talked about books with the focused joy of a man who could not imagine doing anything else. She told him her father had died 3 years ago and left the shop to her younger brother, which was not a thing she could change, but was a thing she had come to terms with mostly. She told him her mother worried about her constantly and wrote letters that were warm and anxious in equal measure, and that she wrote back once a week without fail. She told him why she had wanted to teach. Not because it was the only respectable occupation available to an unmarried educated woman, though that was a true fact of the world, but because she had believed since childhood that the moment a person understood that reading could take them anywhere, to any time, to any mind that had ever thought carefully about anything, that moment was one of the most important moments in a life, and she wanted to be the person who gave children that moment. She had said this before to various people, and the usual response was a kind of polite acknowledgement that mistook conviction for sentimentality. Charles listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then said, simply and directly, that he thought she was right, and that Harlan's Creek was lucky to be getting her. Caroline looked at the road ahead of them and felt something warm and somewhat alarming moving through her chest. They reached Harlan's Creek in the early afternoon, coming into town on the main street from the west in a cloud of dust and good September light. The town was what he had described, a long flat street with false front buildings, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer, women in bonnets carrying baskets, dogs sleeping in patches of shade, and at the far end, set back slightly from the street, a new white-painted building with Harlan's Creek Schoolhouse spelled out in proud black letters across the lintel. Caroline looked at it and felt something so large and complicated in her chest that she had to look away. Charles noticed. "There it is," he said quietly. "There it is," she said. He helped her find the school board chairman, a broad-faced farmer named Mr. Gerald Hooper, who looked her up and down with the particular expression of a man recalibrating his expectations, and then he helped her unload the first several crates of books into the schoolhouse. And when several townspeople materialized out of curiosity to watch the books being carried in, and when Caroline began to describe what each crate contained in her clear, direct voice, she saw Gerald Hooper's expression shift from skeptical recalibration to something more like relief. She was exactly what she had said she was. He recognized that now. Charles loaded the last empty crate back into the wagon and then stood in the schoolhouse doorway while Caroline set books on the shelves she had already identified and categorized and mentally organized on the road from Cincinnati, and she was aware of him there without looking at him, and eventually she turned. "I owe you a great deal," she said. "You owe me nothing," he said. "It was on my way." "It was 3 miles south of your way," she said. "And then it was 14 miles east of your way, because you rode all the way to town when you could have left me at the crossing and continued home." He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to make sure you arrived safely," he said. "Thank you, Charles," she said, and used his first name without planning to, and saw something in his face when she did. "I will be in town on Saturday for supplies," he said. "If you need anything moved or carried." "I will bear that in mind," she said. He put his hat back on and walked to his horse and rode east out of town, and Caroline stood in the doorway of her schoolhouse and watched him until the road curved, and the tall grass closed behind him, and then she turned back to her books with the warm, alarming feeling still present, and making itself comfortable in her chest. She took up residence in the 2 rooms at the back of the schoolhouse that the school board had arranged, which were small and plainly furnished, but had a window that looked east across the grassland, and she spent the rest of that week arranging the school to her exacting satisfaction. She met the women of the Improvement Society, who had furnished the schoolhouse and were warm and curious and desperate to make her feel welcome. She met Reverend Hawes, who was a small, thin man with enormous eyebrows and genuine warmth under a manner that suggested he took the business of salvation very seriously. She met the Weber family, Margaret and David Weber and their 4 children, who were exactly the kind of sturdy, decent people that Charles had described. The school board met her formally on Thursday evening in Gerald Hooper's parlor. There were 4 men on the board, all of them farmers or merchants, all of them polite and somewhat wary. She answered their questions directly and without apology, including the question about whether she intended to stay or whether she would leave when she found a husband, to which she said that she had come to teach school and intended to do exactly that, and that her marital status was her own business, which produced a brief tense silence, and then something that was possibly respect from the oldest board member. A white-haired man named Ezekiel Brand, who had the look of someone who had been underestimated for most of his life and recognized the condition in others. "She will do," Ezekiel Brand said, apparently to the room in general. School opened on the first Monday of October with 27 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Caroline had been warned that the older boys could be difficult, which she had understood to mean they would test her authority, and she had prepared for this by the simple method of being more interesting than they expected. She gave them, on that first Monday morning, a book each to hold and asked them to open it to any page and read the first sentence they saw, and then asked them what that sentence made them think about. And the older boys who had arrived with their arms crossed and their chins set found themselves, almost against their will, having opinions about what they had read. And once a person was having opinions about what they had read, Caroline had them exactly where she wanted them. By the end of the first week, she had 27 students who looked forward to coming to school. By the end of the second week, she had started a lending library from the extra books, which the parents of Harlan's Creek began using almost immediately, because, as she had known perfectly well all along, adults wanted to read too, and simply had not had access to anything worth reading. Charles Hartwell came to town on Saturday, as he had said, and he stopped at the schoolhouse, and Caroline was in the middle of organizing the lending library, and he helped her alphabetize the shelves, which was not a task that required 2 people but which went considerably faster with 2 people, and they talked while they worked. And at some point, Caroline realized that they had been talking for 2 hours and it had felt like 20 minutes. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. They fell into a pattern without discussing it, the way some patterns establish themselves not because they are planned, but because they are natural. He would come to town, he would find some reason to stop at the schoolhouse, they would talk, and then he would stay for supper, first at the hotel and then, when Mrs. Weber made it clear that she found this arrangement both inefficient and unsatisfying, at the Weber family table, where Margaret Weber fed them all with the cheerful generosity of a woman who regarded cooking for 10 as easily as cooking for 6. In October, the grassland turned gold and the sky went deep and blue, and Caroline taught school 5 days a week, and spent her evenings reading and writing letters, and looking out her east window at the land that Charles Hartwell's cattle grazed across, though she could not see his ranch from where she sat. He invited her to see it in the 3rd week of October, framed as a practical question about whether she might like to see how the range land connected to the watershed she had crossed on her way into town. She said yes in the same practical tone, and he came for her on Sunday morning with a saddled horse he had borrowed from the Webers, and they rode out of town together east across the grassland in the clear, cool October air. The ranch was 7 miles from town, set in a natural bowl of land where a creek made a bend, and the cottonwoods were tall and the grass was rich. The house was stone on the lower half and timber on the upper, solid and square, with a porch facing south and 2 windows on the east side, and a kitchen garden that had gone brown with the season but showed evidence of real attention in the summer. There was a good-sized barn and a set of corrals and a bunkhouse where Alejandro lived, who turned out to be a man of about 40 with a patient, weathered face, and a way of looking at Charles Hartwell that communicated a kind of steady, affectionate loyalty. Alejandro was formally polite to Caroline in a way that also managed to convey, somehow, that he had already decided she was acceptable, and she was not sure how he had conveyed that with simple politeness, but he had. Charles showed her the house with what she recognized as the slightly self-conscious manner of a man showing something he was proud of to someone whose opinion matters to him. She walked through the rooms and asked questions and touched the stone of the walls and looked out the windows at the land, and she was thinking, in a part of her mind she was not quite ready to examine directly, that a person could live well in this house, that the rooms had good proportions and the light came in well and the east windows would be particularly good in the morning. "You built this yourself," she said. "With some help," he said. "Alejandro and I did most of it. The stone is from the creek bed." "It will last 100 years," she said. He looked at her when she said that. "That was the intention," he said. They ate lunch on the porch in the October sun, and Alejandro ate with them, and mostly listened, while Caroline and Charles talked. And twice Caroline caught Alejandro looking at Charles with an expression she could only describe as quietly satisfied, and she filed that away. On the ride back to town, the afternoon sun was long and warm, and the light was the particular dense gold of autumn. And they rode side by side on the wagon track and talked about everything and nothing, about the school and the students, and the book she was currently reading, which was a Dickens novel she had pulled from his shelf during the house tour when she saw it, and he had immediately and simply said, "Take it." And about the cattle market and the winter conditions in southern Kansas, and what it took to keep cattle alive in a hard February. At some point, on a long straight stretch of the road where the grassland stretched out to every horizon in the golden afternoon light, they stopped talking and simply rode in silence for a while. And the silence was as comfortable as the conversation, and Caroline was aware of him beside her in the particular way that you become aware of a person when the ordinary mechanisms of conversation are not occupying the part of your attention that would otherwise simply rest on them and be glad of their presence. She thought, "This is a very good man," she thought. "This is a very specific kind of trouble," she thought neither thing aloud. November came in cold and sharp, and the first frost turned the creek bottom to silver in the mornings, and school continued with 27 students who were, by general agreement of the town, doing remarkably well. The older boys who had arrived with their chins set were now the most engaged readers in the class, a development that Caroline found deeply satisfying and that their parents found both surprising and moving. 2 of the mothers started coming to the schoolhouse in the evenings to borrow books and to read together and discuss what they had read, which grew into a small informal reading circle that met on Wednesday evenings, and which Caroline joined and quietly facilitated, and which became one of the things the women of Harlan's Creek looked forward to most that winter. Charles came to town every Saturday without fail. He began staying later, until the light was nearly gone, and then he began finding reasons to come on weekday evenings as well, sometimes with a practical purpose and sometimes without one, and Caroline let him come without making anything of it, because she had found that with Charles Hartwell, things that were true did not need to be pushed. They tended to find their own shape in their own time. He was at the Wednesday reading circle the first time, not as a member, but because he had come to return a book he had borrowed and had stayed when the women were discussing it. And Ezekiel Brand's wife Dorothy had asked his opinion, perhaps with a certain strategic female intention, and he had given his opinion directly and thoughtfully. And Dorothy Brand had looked at Caroline across the circle with an expression that managed to communicate, in the compact language of women who understand each other. that she considered this man to be of notable quality. Caroline had kept her expression entirely neutral and turned the page of her own book, which did not fool Dorothy Brand for a single moment. On the first Saturday of November, Charles came to town, and instead of going to the general store, he came directly to the schoolhouse, which was unusual enough that Caroline looked up from the papers she was marking with a slight alertness. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. He stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands and the November wind moving outside behind him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had seen building for weeks, the expression of a man who has decided on something and is being very careful and very honest about it. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you are willing. I know you have come here for your work and not for that purpose, and I know it is not a simple thing to ask. But I would like to ask it plainly, because you deserve a plain answer and I believe you prefer it." Caroline set down her pen. She looked at him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the plain, honest intention on his face. And she thought about Cincinnati and the bookshop and her father who had died and left a hole in the world that had never quite been filled. And she thought about the way Charles had not interrupted her thinking at the river crossing when he could have, and the way he had said take it when she picked up the Dickens, and the way he had listened to her talk about why she wanted to teach with the kind of attention that meant he was genuinely hearing it. "Yes," she said, "I prefer a plain answer, and yes, I am willing." Something changed in his face, not dramatically, not with a great display, just a settling, a kind of relief and warmth that came together in his expression and made him look younger and more open than she had ever seen him. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said. "Now come in and close the door because it is November and the fire is not large." He came in and closed the door, and he sat down in the chair across from her desk, and she picked up her pen again and went back to marking papers, and he stayed for the rest of the afternoon, and they talked about books and cattle, and the school board's request that she add arithmetic to the older students' curriculum, a request she found sensible and was already implementing. And when the light went, it was Margaret Weber who appeared in the doorway and informed them both that supper was ready and they were both expected. And Caroline put on her coat, and Charles held the door for her, and they walked to the Weber house through the cold November dark, and the stars were out and brilliant and very close in the Kansas sky. They courted through November and December in the way of the frontier, which was more practical and more direct than the elaborate protocols of Eastern cities and infinitely better for it, in Caroline's opinion. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted. She went to the ranch twice more and helped Alejandro start a kitchen garden plan for the spring, which Alejandro received with the quiet pleasure of a man who had been hoping for this development for some time. Charles came to the reading circle on Wednesday evenings, and the women of Harlan's Creek treated this as entirely natural, because they had made up their minds about Charles Hartwell weeks before he had made up his own mind about the situation. He was not a demonstrative man in the way of poetry or declarations, but he was demonstrative in the way that mattered more to Caroline, who had grown up in a bookshop and knew the difference between words said for effect and words said because they were true. He paid attention. He remembered things she said and returned to them. He asked her opinion on things that mattered to him and then actually listened to her answers and incorporated them. He was quietly, consistently, entirely himself, without performance or apology, and Caroline, who had spent her whole life among people who talked about ideas, now found herself in the company of a man who embodied them, which was something she had not expected to find in a cattle rancher in southern Kansas, and which moved her more than she could have said. She told him, one Sunday afternoon in December with the prairie snow light blue and still around them, and their horses standing quiet in the cold, that she had not expected to find him. Not him specifically, she clarified, but the thing he represented, which was a person who would see her as entirely as she saw herself. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was when something landed in him, "I did not expect to find you either," he said. "I had come to believe that what I was building out here I was building alone, and that was simply the way of it." "And now," she said. He looked at her across the blue-white snow. "Now I am very glad it rained upstream," he said. Caroline laughed in the cold December air, and the sound of it went out across the empty prairie. And then he was laughing too, and the horses looked at them both with the mild bewilderment of horses everywhere, and it was the best moment of a December that was full of good moments. The school board met in December to review her first term. She had expected this to be contentious, because Gerald Hooper had been heard to express, in the context of the saloon where he apparently believed women had no intelligent sources, certain reservations about whether a woman teacher from the East could handle a frontier classroom. What she had not expected was for Ezekiel Brand to arrive at that meeting with a letter signed by 14 sets of parents, including 3 that the board considered difficult and one that everyone considered impossible, stating that Miss Pritchard was the best thing that had happened to the children of Harlan's Creek since the founding of the town, and requesting that the board offer her a renewed contract for the spring term without delay. Gerald Hooper renewed her contract without argument. Ezekiel Brand gave her a small formal nod as he left the meeting room, which she understood to be an honor. She wrote to her mother that evening and described all of it, the school and the students and the reading circle and the town, and she described Charles Hartwell with care, because her mother deserved honesty, and she wrote that she had found herself happy in a way she had not been since her father died, which was the truest thing she could say. Her mother wrote back by the end of January, a letter that had traveled by overland mail from Cincinnati and arrived slightly crumpled and smelling of cold, and it said, among many other things, that her father had always believed that the right man for Caroline would be someone who met her where she was rather than expecting her to come down to where he stood, and that it sounded very much like she had found that person, and that her mother intended to visit in the spring. This news prompted a series of domestic preparations in Caroline's rooms at the back of the schoolhouse that prompted Margaret Weber to quietly suggest to Charles that if he had any intentions he was currently in the process of clarifying, the spring would be an excellent timeline. Charles appeared at the schoolhouse on the Thursday evening of the second week of January without any particular practical reason and sat down across from Caroline's desk the way he did, and she put down her pen and waited, because she had learned to read the particular quality of his silences. "I have been thinking," he said. "Yes," she said. "I built that house to last 100 years, he said. "You said that." "I said it," she agreed. "I built it for a family," he said. "I knew that when I was building it, even though I was building it alone and I was not sure there would be a family to live in it. I built the rooms a certain size. I built the kitchen a certain way. I put the windows on the east side because someone told me once that a good east window is the best thing in a house in the morning." Caroline was very still. "I would like you to live in it," he said. "With me, as my wife. I am asking you to marry me, Caroline, not because it is practical, though I believe it would be a practical arrangement of extraordinary quality. Not because everyone in Harlan's Creek has been waiting for me to ask since approximately October, but because I love you, and because I believe you are the person those east windows were waiting for, and because I would like to spend the rest of my life talking to you and listening to you and building things with you that last 100 years. The schoolroom was very quiet. Outside, the January wind was moving over the prairie with its low, cold voice, and the fire in the small stove was burning steadily, and the smell of wood smoke and old books in January cold was all around them. "Charles," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since the river, I think, or perhaps since the camp that first night when you made coffee before I woke. I am not certain of the exact moment. It may have come in pieces. But yes, yes, I will marry you, and yes, I would very much like to live in that house, and yes, the east windows will be well used, and yes to all of it." He reached across the desk and took her hand, and held it in both of his. And the fire in the stove burned, and the January wind moved outside, and Charles Hartwell looked at Caroline Pritchard across the scarred wooden surface of the schoolteacher's desk, with the entire substance of what he felt for her clear on his face, and said nothing more because nothing more was needed. They were married in March in the Methodist church, in the particular bright, cruel cold of early Kansas spring, when the light is brilliant and sharp, and the wind still carries the memory of February in it, but the grass is beginning to come green at the root. Reverend Hawes performed the ceremony with his enormous eyebrows drawn together in an expression of solemn joy. The entire town of Harlan's Creek attended, because the entire town of Harlan's Creek had a proprietary interest in this outcome, having watched it develop since September with a collective patience that bordered on the invested. Caroline's mother had arrived from Cincinnati 10 days before the wedding, a small woman in a good traveling coat who had taken one look at Charles Hartwell and then taken Caroline aside and said, in the direct way that ran evidently in the family, that he was very much what she had hoped for and considerably better looking than the letter had suggested. Charles had been formally introduced to her the following morning and had been entirely himself, steady and honest and attentive, and by the end of that day, Caroline's mother had adopted him with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who understood that the family she had is not always the same as the family she builds. The wedding itself was everything a frontier wedding in 1873 could be, which was considerable. The women of the reading circle decorated the church. Margaret Weber made a cake from actual eggs and real white sugar, both of which required sacrifice and were given freely. Alejandro wore his best coat and stood with Charles, and when the Reverend asked who stood for the groom, Alejandro said, in a voice that was steady and clear, that he did, and the way he said it told everyone in that church that he had been standing for Charles Hartwell for years and intended to continue. Caroline wore her best dress, which was blue wool with white collar and cuffs, and she had flowers in her hair that Margaret Weber's daughter had woven in with the patient artistry of a 12-year-old taking a serious assignment seriously. And when she walked into the church and saw Charles standing at the front of it in his best coat with his hat in his hands, and his dark eyes finding her the moment she appeared in the doorway, she walked to him through the full church with the certainty of a woman who has made a decision that is entirely right for entirely the right reasons. They said the words in Reverend Hawes' deep formal voice, and the church was so quiet during the vows that you could hear the March wind outside, and the small sounds of 27 students sitting in the pews beside their families and trying their best to be still. After the wedding, there was a celebration at the Webers that filled every room of the house and spilled onto the porch, and there was fiddle music and the particular warmth of a frontier community closing itself around something good, and Caroline danced with Charles, and then with Ezekiel Brand, and then with several small children who had strong opinions about dancing and no inhibitions about expressing them. And at some point late in the evening, she found herself standing on the porch with Charles's hand in hers, and the cold March dark around them, and the music coming through the window, and she looked east toward the ranch and the house with its east windows, and felt so completely in the right place that it was almost frightening. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said. They moved to the ranch in April after the spring term ended and a plan was arranged for the following fall. Caroline had been quite clear with the school board that her marriage did not change her intentions regarding the school, and that if the board was considering whether a married woman could be expected to continue teaching, she wished to address that question directly and in advance. The school board, perhaps understanding by now that direct advance address was simply how this particular teacher operated, agreed to continue her contract. Ezekiel Brand had again been the decisive voice. Life on the ranch in those first months was a revelation to Caroline, who had lived always in cities and knew about land mostly from books. She learned quickly because she learned everything quickly, and what she did not know she asked about without embarrassment, because embarrassment about ignorance had always struck her as the most counterproductive of social emotions when simple questions were available. Charles taught her to ride better than she could. Alejandro taught her the kitchen garden and the rhythm of the seasons in that particular piece of land, what grew and when and why. She learned the names of the grasses, which she had promised herself she would do since the day Charles had mentioned his range management book, and she learned to read the weather in the sky the way Charles did, the particular quality of a cloud building on the southwest horizon, the smell of the air before rain. She kept the schoolhouse books carefully inventoried and added to them when the school board's budget allowed, and she began a small project of writing down things she wanted future teachers to know, which she privately thought of as notes for whoever came after her, and which were, she was told years later, the most useful document any teacher in that county had ever left behind. In May, she discovered she was expecting a child. She told Charles at the east window in the morning, while the light was doing what she had promised herself it would do in that house, coming in gold and generous across the kitchen table, and she watched his face when she told him, and what she saw there made her understand some things about him that she had suspected but not known with certainty, which was that the quiet surface of him covered a depth of feeling that was vast and steady as the Kansas land itself, and that she had not yet seen the full reach of it. He sat for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly well," she said. He nodded slowly, and then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said nothing for a while, and the morning light came through the east window and the prairie was gold and green outside, and the depth of the feeling in that room between them was so full and still that it was its own kind of speaking. "I am going to need to add a room," he said eventually. "You are always adding a room," she said. "I like building things," he said. "You have given me more reasons to build things." "I intend to continue." She laughed and he smiled, and they sat at the table in the east window light and made plans. Caroline's mother came back in June, unable to stay away, which Caroline had expected and welcomed. She was installed in the newly added room and took to ranch life with the adaptable energy of a woman who had raised Caroline Pritchard from birth, and was therefore not surprised by anything the world put in front of her. She took over the kitchen garden from Alejandro with his blessing, learned to make biscuits from the flour that came from Dodge City on the supply wagon, and formed an alliance with the Weber family that was sealed within a week and lasted the rest of her life. The baby was born in December, a boy, arriving in the middle of a snowstorm with the assistance of the local doctor who had ridden 6 miles in the snow and arrived cheerful and entirely competent, and with the additional assistance of Margaret Weber and Caroline's mother, who between them had more experience with births than the doctor and were not shy about saying so. They named him Thomas, after Caroline's father. Charles held his son for the first time in the east window light. The December snow blew outside and the fire in the stove burning well, and he looked at Thomas with the same depth Caroline had seen when she told him the baby was coming, that vast quiet depth that was the true interior of him. And Caroline, who was tired and warm and entirely happy, watched her husband with their son in the morning light, and thought that there was no book she had ever read, no sentence she had ever carried with her through difficulty, that came close to the reality of this particular moment. Thomas was a solid and curious baby who grew into a solid and curious child. He learned to read at 4, because he had been surrounded by books from his first days, and because Caroline was his mother, and he read with the absorbed pleasure of a person for whom reading is simply what the mind does when given the opportunity. He followed Alejandro around the ranch like a small, determined shadow, learning the names of things and asking why about everything, and Alejandro answered every question with patience and care, because Alejandro was that kind of person. In the spring of Thomas's 2nd year, Caroline discovered she was expecting again, and in November of 1876 a daughter arrived, small and dark-haired and immediately opinionated, whom they named Clara after Charles's mother. Clara walked at 9 months and talked at 10, and by 2 years old had organized the other children of the ranch and surrounding farms into what she clearly regarded as her personal court, a development that Charles observed with a mixture of amusement and something that might have been slight alarm. "She is like you," he told Caroline. "She is like herself," Caroline said. "That is the best thing she could be." The years built on each other the way the house had built, room by room, solid and intentional, each part connected to the last. The school continued to grow. The lending library became a permanent fixture that survived 3 school board chairmen, 2 of whom had expressed reservations about it, and one of whom had eventually become its most enthusiastic patron. The reading circle met every Wednesday and had expanded to include women from farms as far as 12 miles out, who drove in on Wednesday evenings and back in the dark, because the conversation and the books were worth the cold. The ranch grew steadily, not dramatically but soundly, the way Charles had always built things. A third hand came on after 2 years. A young man from Texas named Will Garrett, who was 20 years old and had come north on a cattle drive, and found Harlan's Creek more to his liking than anything he'd encountered since leaving home, and who absorbed everything Alejandro taught him with the focused gratitude of someone who has found the thing they are supposed to be doing. There were difficulties. The winter of 1876 into 1877 was brutal, the kind of Kansas winter that took cattle and sometimes people, and they lost 40 head and spent 6 weeks barely leaving the house. And Caroline taught Thomas and Clara their lessons at the kitchen table, while the wind drove the snow against the east windows, and the ranch was a snow-muffled world of firelight and close warmth, and the constant low-grade work of keeping the livestock alive. Charles and Alejandro and Will spent those weeks in the kind of sustained, hard physical labor that left them too tired for conversation at the end of each day. And Caroline learned that the thing she could do that mattered most in those weeks was keep the house warm and the food ready and the children calm. And she did all 3 with total dedication. There were also the ordinary injustices of the time that touched them in various ways. Alejandro, who was Mexican-born and had been in Kansas since before the war, navigated a world that did not always make a space for him with the quiet dignity of a man who had decided long ago that his worth was not determined by other people's errors. There were men in Harlan's Creek who addressed him without the courtesy they would give a white man, and when this happened in Charles's presence, Charles addressed it, not with drama but with the steady, quiet insistence that was his most characteristic quality, making it clear that Alejandro was his partner and his friend and a man of complete standing, and that any failure to treat him accordingly was a failure he was not prepared to accept. Caroline had the same clarity on the subject and made it known in her own domain, which included 27 children who were learning, among other things, that decency was not a selective quality. The spring of 1878 brought good rain and good grass, and the news that Harlan's Creek was growing. A railroad survey had come through the previous fall, and there were serious conversations about a spur line, which would change everything about the town's connection to the wider world. Caroline followed this development with the particular attention of a person who understood that a railroad meant not just commerce but books, more books, faster, and in greater variety, and she was already writing letters to publishers in Cincinnati about what a rail connection might mean for the school's library. Thomas started school officially that fall, sitting in his mother's classroom in the odd position of being the teacher's son, which he navigated with the equanimity of a child who had been well prepared for the world by both his parents. He was, as Caroline had known he would be, the kind of reader who found everything interesting, and the children in the class accepted him with the pragmatic ease of frontier children who had more pressing things to worry about than social hierarchy. On a Saturday evening in October of 1878, 5 years after Caroline had sat on the tongue of her wagon, and told herself firmly that she was not going to cry at a flooded river crossing in the middle of Kansas, Charles and Caroline were sitting on the south porch of the ranch house after supper, with the October dark around them, and the stars brilliant overhead, and the sound of Thomas and Clara's voices from inside where Caroline's mother was reading to them before bed. The cottonwoods along the creek were yellow in the way of October, and there was a smell of wood smoke from the chimney and cool, clean air from the north. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Caroline said. "Tell me," he said. "That man at the Immigrant Society office in Cincinnati," she said. "The one who suggested I find a husband before coming west. What about him? I think about how I would very much like to write him a letter," she said, explaining that the sequence of events was correct after all, that I came west first and found everything else in the coming. Charles looked at the dark field of stars over the Kansas grassland, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she knew completely by now. "That seems like a worthwhile letter to write," he said. "I may also mention the books," she said. "You should lead with the books," he said. "I always lead with the books," she said. He reached out and took her hand in the way he had across the desk in the schoolroom 5 years ago, and they sat in the October dark with the cottonwoods turning yellow and the stars enormous overhead, and the voices of their children drifting through the window. And Caroline thought about the river, about the way it had looked that September afternoon when she first saw it was impassable, brown and muscular and indifferent, and the way she had sat on the wagon tongue and told herself firmly that she was not going to cry. And then she thought about the sound of a horse behind her, and a voice saying she would want to back the wagon up about 30 feet. And then she thought about all the things that had followed from that moment. The camp by the creek with the coffee made before she woke, the crossing with the tarp tied over 23 crates of books, the town coming into view in the afternoon light with the new schoolhouse at the end of the street, the Saturday visits and the reading circle and the first proposal, and the second proposal that was actually a marriage proposal, and the church in March and Thomas in the east window light and Clara, who had organized the world into her personal court before she was 3 years old, and the winter that took 40 cattle, and the long, steady accumulation of days that were good because they were lived with care and intention and the particular grace that comes from knowing exactly where you are supposed to be. "Charles," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad it rained upstream," she said. He laughed, the full laugh she still loved for how rarely and how completely it came, and in the house behind them she heard her mother's voice rising with the story she was reading and Thomas asking a question and Clara's voice giving an answer that was too confident to be correct. And the fire was burning in the stove, and the east windows were dark now with the October night, but she knew what they would do in the morning, and everything was exactly as it should be. She thought of one more thing to say, something she had been turning over in her mind since the spring, when she had written in her notes for future teachers a passage about why she had come west and what she had found here, and she had written it carefully and revised it twice and had not yet said it aloud. "I have been thinking about what to tell the students," she said, "about why reading matters, about why I brought all those books across the river." "What will you tell them?" he said. "I will tell them that the books made it possible for me to be exactly who I was when the moment required it," she said. "That everything I had read gave me the language and the framework to understand what I was seeing and feeling, and to act on it clearly. That when I was sitting on the bank of the Cimarron River with no way across, and everything I had brought with me in that wagon and no idea what came next, the thing that kept me from panic was not courage exactly, but a kind of informed confidence that came from having read about people in impossible situations who found their way through them." She paused. "And then of course a cowboy came along who knew the river, and knew how to tie a proper teamster's hitch," he said. "That too," she said, "that was very reassuring." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking in the way she had learned to read over 5 years of sitting beside him and across from him and talking and being silent and being every kind of close that two people can be. "You would have made it without me," he said. "I might have made it without you," she said, "but I would not have made this." She meant the porch, the house, the children inside, the east windows, the 5 years and all the years still ahead of them. "This required you specifically." He brought her hand up and held it for a moment against the side of his face, which was a gesture she had seen him make twice before, both times at moments of such complete feeling that words had not been available, and she understood it again for what it was. A man who was not built for performance finding the most direct way he knew to say the thing that was most true. The October stars turned overhead, and the cottonwoods rustled by the creek, and Thomas called out something from inside that was not an alarm, just the ordinary call of a child finding something interesting in the pages of a book, and Clara's voice answered with the authority of an almost 2-year-old who had opinions about everything. And Caroline's mother said something in the warm, patient tone she used with the grandchildren, and the fire in the stove kept burning. The following spring the railroad spur came through, and with it the first real bookshop that Harlan's Creek had ever had, opened by a man named Franklin Oakes who had come from St. Louis and who became, within 6 months, one of Caroline's most enthusiastic partners in the matter of keeping the school library stocked and current. The reading circle moved its Wednesday meetings to the back room of Franklin's shop on the evenings when there was a new shipment to discuss, which was most of the time. Thomas at 5 was a reader of such dedication that Caroline had to institute a lights-out rule that she was not certain she enforced consistently enough, because she would walk past his door at 9 o'clock and see the faint glow of the candle and hear the faint silence of someone reading very quietly, and she would stand in the hallway for a moment before going in, because she remembered that feeling, that absolutely necessary feeling of the next page. And she was not entirely sure she had the authority to interrupt it. Charles took Thomas riding in the mornings before school, as he had done since Thomas was old enough to sit in a saddle, and he was teaching him the grasses and the creek and the land the way he knew it, which was deeply and exactly, and with the kind of knowledge that comes from years of careful attention. Thomas received this education with the same focused interest he gave to everything, asking questions and filing away answers and connecting them to things he had read, because he was exactly who his 2 parents had made him. Clara, who turned 3 in November of that spring, had by this time fully established her position as the gravitational center of every room she entered. She was not a difficult child in any way that caused real trouble, but she was a child who was constitutionally incapable of being peripheral to anything. And this quality, combined with her father's quiet determination and her mother's absolute conviction about everything she believed, produced a small person of remarkable presence. Alejandro said once, with his characteristic understated accuracy, that Clara Hartwell was going to be very interesting to know when she was grown, and Caroline thought this was probably the most accurate prediction she had heard in southern Kansas. In the summer of that year, Caroline discovered she was expecting a 3rd child. She told Charles again at the east window, as she had done twice before, and he responded as he had done twice before, with the depth and the quiet that she had come to understand as the fullest expression of who he was. And then he said he needed to add another room, and she told him she expected nothing less. The room he added was on the south side of the house, where the light was good all day, and where you could see both the creek bottom and the main approach from the west, which was the road to Harlan's Creek. And Caroline chose this room for herself as a study and put bookshelves along 2 walls and a desk at the south window. And it became the room where she planned her lessons and wrote her letters and sat in the evenings when the children were in bed and Charles was reading at the kitchen table. The room where she did her best thinking in the particular way that a person thinks when they are absolutely at home in their work and their place. The 3rd child came in February, a boy they named after Charles's father William, who had died before Charles came west, and whom he had spoken of with the particular kind of grief that comes from admiring someone you did not get enough time with. William was a long, solemn-faced baby who looked at everything with dark, serious eyes, and who grew into a child of extraordinary calm, the kind of calm that is not absence of feeling, but rather its full organization, and who learned to read almost simultaneously with learning to walk, because that was what you did in the Hartwell house. The ranch at this point had 350 head and was in its most productive period, well managed and soundly run. And Charles had made the kind of reputation among the ranchers and farmers of the region that attaches to a man who has always done what he said, and said what he meant and built things that lasted. He was not a prominent man in the way of loud presence, but he was a man of significant standing, the kind that is established not by announcement but by years of consistent quality. And when he spoke in the context where ranchers gathered to discuss grazing rights and water access, and the various practical politics of the frontier, people listened with the specific attention reserved for a man whose opinion comes from real knowledge. Caroline at 32 was 5 years into her teaching in Harlan's Creek and had remade the school into something the founders of the town would not have recognized, not because she had changed its essential purpose, but because she had fulfilled it so completely. The students who had passed through her classroom were, by general acknowledgement, better prepared for whatever came next than students anywhere else in the county. Several of the older students she had taught in the first 2 years had gone on to further education, which was not common from Harlan's Creek, and which caused a kind of proud civic excitement whenever it happened. She had also, by this point, written a series of letters to the Kansas State School Board about the condition of frontier education in general, letters that were specific and detailed and carefully argued, and that had resulted in a formal inquiry, and then a visiting committee, and then a modest expansion of the state educational fund for frontier schools, a development that the Harlan's Creek School Board had celebrated, and that Ezekiel Brand, now in his 70s but still the most useful member of any body he joined, had taken great satisfaction in. He told Caroline, at the celebration dinner that was held at the Weber house with a great deal of food and considerable fiddle music, that her father had been right about towns and libraries, and that it turned out the same was true about towns and teachers. Caroline had to excuse herself for a moment after he said that. On a May morning in 1880, Caroline was in her study at the south window with the spring light coming in bright and warm and the prairie green and full outside, and she was writing a lesson plan for the final week of school, and she could hear through the window Charles talking to Thomas about something in the yard below, and she could hear Clara somewhere in the house with the decisive small footsteps of a child going somewhere important. And William's quiet concentration could be felt in the house, the way weather is felt before it arrives. She set down her pen and looked out the south window at the approaching road from town, at the long grass moving in the May wind, at the cottonwoods along the creek in their new green, and she thought very deliberately about the river. She thought about it often, the way a person thinks about a hinge point, a moment that pivoted everything. The swollen brown Cimarron in September of 1873, the way it had looked impossible, the way she had sat on the wagon tongue and had her firm conversation with herself about crying. 23 crates of books under a tarpaulin, Robert and Thackeray flattening their ears at the water, the map with its casual pencil scratch where the crossing was. And then the horse behind her and the voice. "You are going to want to back that wagon up about 30 feet. She thought about how close she had come to not hearing it, to having driven into the soft clay before he arrived, to having been stuck in a different and more complicated way. She thought about the 3 miles south to the shallow crossing, and the 40 minutes along the river in the evening light, and the camp by the creek with the coffee made before she woke. She thought, if the river had not been flooded. She thought, if he had come along 10 minutes earlier and interrupted her thinking. She thought, if she had gone back to Pratt instead of waiting. She thought all of these things with the particular gratitude of someone who understands that the architecture of a life is partly intention, and partly the accidents that intention meets on the road, and that the skill is not in preventing the accidents, but in being present enough and ready enough to receive what they bring. Charles appeared in the doorway of the study. He had flour on his coat, which meant he had been in the kitchen, which happened more often than anyone who knew him from the range world would have predicted, because it turned out he had a genuine interest in cooking that he had not had the opportunity to develop until he had a kitchen worth cooking in. "Come outside," he said. "Thomas has something to show you." She put down her pen and followed him through the house and out the south door into the May morning, where Thomas was standing in the kitchen garden beside a row of something green and new that had just come up, looking at it with the expression of a 7-year-old who has accomplished something and is fairly sure the adults will agree it is significant. "I planted those in April," Thomas said. "Alejandro told me where to put them. They are beans." "Those are very good beans," Caroline said, looking at the neat row of seedlings. "They will be much bigger by July," Thomas said, with the authority of someone who had done research on the subject. "I know," she said. "I am counting on it." She stood in the kitchen garden in the May morning with Charles beside her, and Thomas pointing out the beans and Clara appearing from somewhere to assess the beans with judicial seriousness, and William standing quietly in the doorway observing everything. And the prairie went out in every direction in its May green abundance, and the east windows of the house caught the morning light and threw it back, and somewhere along the creek the cottonwoods were whispering in the warm wind. And a meadowlark was saying its piece from a fence post, with the absolute conviction of a meadowlark that its information is important. She reached sideways and found Charles's hand, and he folded his around hers in the way he had since January on a schoolroom desk, and she thought, "This is where I am. This is what came from following the river south and crossing where it was shallow and letting a man with a coil of rope and a quiet voice show her the way. 23 crates of books. All of them still here, in the school and on the shelves, and in the hands of the children of Harlan's Creek and the farms around it, and in the hands of the 3 children who lived in this house and who would grow up knowing, as their mother had always known, that a book was a door and every door was worth opening." She had written in her notes for future teachers that the most important quality in a teacher was the conviction that knowledge was not a possession but a gift that multiplied in the giving. She had believed that since her father's bookshop. She believed it still. She believed also, standing in the May kitchen garden with her husband's hand in hers and her children pointing at beans, that love was the same way. That it was not diminished by the giving but increased by it, that it went out in rings like water from a dropped stone, touching everything it reached. "We need to go back inside," Charles said. "I was making cornbread." "You cannot leave cornbread unattended," Thomas said, in the serious tone he used when relaying information he considered vital. "Absolutely not," Caroline agreed. They went inside, all 5 of them, into the warm house with the east windows and the bookshelves and the years of building, and the door closed on the May morning, and the meadowlark kept on from its fence post, and the beans grew in their row, and the river 7 miles west ran through the grass at its ordinary level, shallow and clear and easy to cross, as though it had never been anything else.